Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. So, as always, thank you all for coming. And tonight will be our first lecture actually commenting on the work. And I did actually have some extra copies of the book that someone generously donated, and I left those at home. I apologize. But inshallah, I think that's the one. Is it Dar es Salaam? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's it. Jazakallah khair, Brother Muhammad. So inshallah ta'ala, I'll try to be more mindful next week and make sure I bring those copies so that everyone will have a copy in hand. So the Imam Mujaddid, he begins his book, rahimahullah ta'ala, Kitab at-Tawhid, the book of monotheism. And the translator, he headed that by saying chapter number 1. But in reality, in the original work, this is an untitled section of the book. It is not a chapter. And this untitled section, it actually serves as the preface of the book, and the first chapter is the one that follows it. So just a little note there. So now here, if you notice, if you look when you go to chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 in this copy, you're going to notice that the Imam will say something like Babu Fadl Tawhid wa ma yukaffir min dhunub. He'll say the chapter and then give the title of the chapter. In that case, he said the chapter of the virtue of a Tawheed and what it expiates of sins. Then a little further, he'll say something to the effect of Babu ma ja'a and the sabab kufri bani Adam wa tarkihim dinahum al-ghulub as-salihin. He'll say, for example, chapter that the cause of man disbelieving and straying from his religion is his being excessive when it comes to the righteous people, right? So every time he has this chapter, but notice here, there's no chapter. Kitab at-Tawhid, the book of monotheism. So what does he intend by this preface? Well, when you look at the proof texts that he brings and what they all have in common, you can see that he had an objective by mentioning what he mentioned before actually starting the book with the chapters. And that is that he wanted to establish that a Tawheed is obligatory. It's mandatory upon every human being and every jinn. And so therefore, this preface could be appropriately titled Wujub at-Tawhid al-A'yani min al-Insi wal-Jinn. The mandate or the requirement upon mankind and jinnkind to observe a Tawheed. That basically what the Imam has set out to do in this preface is to establish that this book that I'm writing, I'm not writing it because I'm going to talk about something optional. Something that it's good to do, but you don't have to do. I'm writing this book because you have to do it. Not just you have to do it, it is the most obligatory obligation upon, as they say, al-mutakallafin, those people who are responsible for their deeds. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through the proof texts and comment upon them. And what I want you to do as we go through them is I want you to look at the text and try to figure out, how does it support the Imam's objective? Where is the proof in this ayah or this hadith that he quotes that Tawheed is wajib, it's obligatory, we have to do it, okay? So pay attention to that as we go through the examples. So the first one he brings, rahimahullah ta'ala, is the ayah from Surah Al-Dariyat, the 51st chapter. The 51st chapter, verse number 56, in which Allah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. And I, meaning Allah, did not create the jinn and men except to worship me. So before we look at how this verse proves what we said, let's look at some of the words in the verse and comment upon those. So, if you notice in this verse, there is this lam before the word or before the phrase ya'budun, worship me alone. That lam in Arabic is what we call ta'liliya. And what that means is that what follows that lam is the wisdom, the purpose, or the reason for what preceded it. So it's as if Allah is saying, I did not create jinnkind and mankind except for the wisdom, for the purpose, for the reason of worshiping me. Right? So the reason why we've been created is to worship Allah. That's the wisdom. Some people will do it. Some people won't do it. But regardless whether they do it or they don't do it, that is the wisdom. Whether they accept it, they acknowledge it or not, that's the wisdom. Then he says, لِيَعْبُدُونَ, so that they worship me. Like, what does Allah mean here by worship? The word worship, it can be defined depending on how you, or the perspective from which you look at it. So sometimes we look at worship from the point of view of the actor. I'm sorry, the act, I should say, the act. The acts that constitute worship. Sometimes we look at worship from the point of view of the actor, the one who does it. And sometimes we look at worship when we try to define it from the point of view of Allah's will primarily and the will of the actor secondarily. So let's look at all of those and how they establish for us what Allah means when He says, I have not created jinnkind and mankind except to worship me. So first of all, the acts. The acts of worship and what constitutes worship, we've already established that when we did the introduction. Ibn Taymiyyah defined al-ibadah from the point of view of the acts that constitute worship as ismun jami' li kulli ma yuhibbuhu Allah wa yardah min al-aqwali wal-a'mali al-zahira wal-batina. He said it is a comprehensive term that encompasses everything that Allah loves and is pleased with, from statements and actions, whether hidden or apparent. So when Allah says, I created jinnkind and mankind to worship me, He means, from the point of view of the acts, I created all of you to do the things that I love and am pleased with, right? To perform these acts that I love and am pleased with, to do those things. Another meaning of al-ibadah has to do with the actor, us. And that definition, as the scholars have mentioned, is kamal al-dhul wa kamal al-mahabba. The complete humility and the peak or pinnacle of love. Meaning, Allah is saying, I have created you so that you would be absolutely humble and submissive to me. And so that you would love me absolutely, unconditionally. You guys see that? So that's another meaning of al-ibadah. So Allah created us to do the things that He loves and is pleased with, the acts. He also created us as actors to what? To be totally submissive to Him, totally humble before Him, and to love Him absolutely unconditionally. And finally, al-ibadah in the Quran and the Sunnah, it can be looked at from the point of view of Allah's will primarily and our will secondarily. Meaning, if you look at the creatures, everything Allah created, down to the atom, can any of them disobey Allah if He doesn't want them to? Can any of them depart from His will and what He allows and permits? Can that happen? Can fire burn if Allah doesn't want it to burn? Can the earth devour and cause a dead body to decompose if Allah doesn't want that? Because even the atoms and even the worms and even the different things in the earth that would typically eat a body up, they're all what? Slaves to who? To Allah. You guys see that? And so there's a type of ibadah which the scholars have called kawniyah or ikrahiyah. The ibadah of being compelled to do what Allah wills, whether you like it or not. You guys see that? That's a type of ibadah. And that's the ibadah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about in the verse in Surah Maryam. So Surah Maryam is the 19th chapter, verse number 93, in which Allah says, إِن كُلُّ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ إِلَّا آتِ الرَّحْمَنِ عَبَدًا. There is nothing in the heavens or the earth except that it comes to Allah as an obedient servant. Even the atoms, even the worms in the earth, even fire, the wind, the rain, whatever it is, it obeys Allah. Is that the ibadah that Allah is talking about in this verse? The ibadah when He says, I've created mankind and jinkind to worship me against their will? No, abadan. The ibadah that He's talking about is the other side of that coin that we were just talking about, which is al-ibadah al-shar'iyyah or at-Tawhid. The worship of what? Of willful obedience and worshiping Allah happily, wanting to do it, choosing to do it. And that's the ibadah that Allah is talking about when He says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I created them to what? To willfully and happily, to want to worship me and to do it by choice, not by force. You guys see that? So these are the three meanings of ya'budun or liya'budun in the ayah. Now tell me how the ayah proves that at-Tawhid is obligatory upon every human being and every jinn. How does it prove that? Anyone? Any takers?
Because seem like if we don't do, there is a punishment behind.
But He doesn't mention a punishment though. He just said, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I've not created jinkind and mankind except to worship me. I've created them for this purpose. If they don't do it, He doesn't say in this ayah that He'll punish them. So how does the ayah show me that we have to do it? It's wajib. At-Tawhid. Okay, He wants us to do a lot of things. He wants us to pray tahajjud, pray at night. But we don't have to do it. At-Tawhid. Haqq al-ibadi in this ayah? Haqq al-ibad, our rights upon Allah.
No.
Like how? Show me how. I agree with you, but show me how. Tell me how.
Because He created us, and that's the obligation or what we are required to do.
Okay, prove that we're required from this verse, though. I agree with everything you're saying, but we need
the creation of us.
Okay, He mentioned the creation of us, but how does that prove? See, and this is what we have to be able to do. We have to be able to what? To
He said that was why He created us. It said, except that they should worship me. So if this is the reason for our creation, then this is what we need to do.
And that makes sense, right? Let's say, for example, I own a restaurant. And I hire a person, and his job is burger flipper, right? Somebody who's hired specifically to man the grill and to flip those, burgers. That's specifically his job. He might have some other jobs. When you're free, I want you to go clean the restrooms. When you're free, I want you to take out the trash. But your primary job is to what? To man that grill. So, is it optional for him to do the thing that I hired him to do? Or is that mandatory? It's mandatory. So if Allah says, I created you for this purpose, it means what? It's obligatory. You have to do it. It's not an option. You guys see that? Because He made it the purpose or the reason, that means it's what? Required. Just like if one of us hired someone and hired them specifically for that purpose, it means we expect them to do that, and they don't have an option in doing that. It's like, well, I chose today not to flip burgers. The orders were piling up, but I just didn't feel like it. And we'd be like, okay. No, we'd be like, no, that's your job. That's why I hired you. That's why you're here. You guys see that? Tayyib, mumtaz. All right, tayyib. After that, the Imam, he mentions the verse from Surah An-Nahl, the 16th chapter, verse number 36, in which he says, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنْ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. He says, and verily we have sent among every ummah, every religious community, every nation, a messenger proclaiming, worship Allah alone, commanding them to worship Allah alone and avoid at-Taghut, and to avoid the false deities. Right? Alright. So there's a few things in this verse. One is that Allah is telling us that all the prophets without exception, they call to what? At-Tawhid. They call to the oneness of Allah. So if they all called to the oneness of Allah, what does that tell you about the oneness of Allah as it relates to Allah's religion? Is it marginal or is it at the center? It's at what? It's at the center. It's the most obligatory and necessary aspect of religion. You guys see that? So that's one of the ways that the ayah shows that Tawhid is obligatory, because it's the most what? Central and essential part of religion, because all the prophets call to that. Did all the prophets call to did all of them call to 5 times prayer? No. Did they all call to certain foods being prohibited? No, they didn't. So some of the foods that we're allowed to eat were prohibited in other what? In other faiths, and vice versa. And so the point is that there are certain things that the prophets they didn't all call to, but the one thing that they all called to without exception is what? At-Tawhid. He said that they did what? They proclaimed, they commanded, and Abd'Llah. They what? They mentioned an imperative. Worship Allah. They ordered their people to worship Allah. In the Quran, if we have a command in the Quran, that indicates what? Obligation. Anytime we have a command in the Quran or in the Hadith, it indicates obligation. So if these prophets came and ordered their people to worship Allah alone, it means what? That Tawheed is obligatory. But ثم بعد ذلك, he said, وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتِ, and avoid the false deities. What is a taghut? Essentially, تفضلي.
الطاغوت هو مشتق من الطغيان تجاوز الحد.
صح. That basically, as the sister said, جزاها khair, is that a taghut is taken from the word at-Tughyan, which means what? To go beyond the limits. To go beyond the limits. And basically, in Islamic terminology, essentially, a taghut is anything which is worshipped besides Allah. Okay, and there's other definitions, more specific definitions that have a lot to do with the Tughyan, as the sister said. But essentially, when a taghut is mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith, it means something which is worshipped besides Allah. So these prophets, they came and they ordered their people to worship Allah alone. But they also simultaneously ordered them to avoid the false deities, right? So that means that not only did they order them to worship Allah, but they forbade them from worshiping other than Allah, as if to say that when we obligate a Tawheed, it necessitates what? Avoiding a shirk, avoiding its opposite. It's not enough to worship Allah, but you also have to what? Avoid worshiping other than Allah. When you call to a Tawheed, it's not enough to say worship Allah, but you also have to warn against and tell people to avoid a shirk. And this is important because in many cases when we talk about a Tawheed, we talk about the deen. Sometimes we need to warn people against the wrong things. We tell them about the good things, but we also have to warn them about the bad things. And what many people say is they say, for example, just tell people the good things and don't tell people the bad things. Tell people what they're supposed to do, but don't tell them what they're not supposed to do. Or they'll say, in the case of a Tawheed, talk about what it means to observe the oneness of Allah, but don't criticize the people who violate that. But that's contradictory to what? To the way of the prophets. Because they wouldn't just tell the people the good things, they would also tell them the bad things. They wouldn't just tell the people to worship Allah, but they would also tell them to avoid at-Tawhid. And they would explain to them what that is. What is a shirk? And tell them to avoid it. And so sometimes we have to point out the wrong things. We have to point out the wrong things that other people say that contradict the right thing, so that people will avoid doing the wrong thing or listen to the people who are calling to the wrong thing. So this part of this ayah, it's an indication that the worship of Allah, it can't truly be achieved. We can't truly achieve ibadah. A person can't be considered worshiping Allah if they worship along with Allah something other than Allah. So we need to know at-Tawhid, but we also need to know a shirk. Now, how can you avoid a shirk if you don't know it? You guys see that? How can you avoid something that you don't know, you don't recognize? Right? It could walk right up to you and look you in the face and you wouldn't know it. How can you avoid it? And that's why the poet, he said, عرفت الشر لا للشر ولكن لتواقيه ومن لم يعرف الشر وقع فيه. He said, I learned about evil not for evil's sake, not because I'm into evil, not because I like evil. I learned about evil so that I could avoid it. And he who does not know evil is certain to do what? To fall into it. You guys see that? So we have to learn about what a shirk is to avoid it, which is one of the reasons why we're studying this work, is because there are many Muslims, unfortunately, inadvertently, who fall into what? A shirk. Some of the things that they say, some of the things that they do, some things they believe. Not intentionally, not wittingly, but unwittingly, because they have not studied a shirk and determined and clearly understood what that is, what constitutes a shirk. طيب. Now, in the ayah, it starts out by saying, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ. And we have appointed, we have raised in every nation, every religious community. So should we understand from that the message of Allah has reached every person? There's not a person on this earth who the message of Allah has not reached. Should we understand that? Is that what the verse is saying?
No.
So the verse is saying that every religious community, the message reached them. But not every individual in those communities did the message reach. There's going to be some people who are totally oblivious of what? Of truth. Totally oblivious of Allah's religion. And this is supported by the hadith collected by Ahmed and others. On the authority of Abu Hurairah, in which the Prophet said, أَرْبَعَةٌ يَحْتَجُّونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. He said there are going to be 4 people who will plead their case before Allah on the Day of Judgment. And he mentioned one of them, وَرَجُلٌ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْفَتْرَةِ. And one of them is a man from the period in which no messenger was sent. So a messenger comes, and he passes away, and his message remains. And over time, what happens? The truth in that message becomes diluted with falsehood. And it gets to a point where the truth and the falsehood can't be distinguished. And it's time for Allah to send another messenger. So there's a period where the message of one messenger has lost its what? Its utility. And another messenger has not been sent. That's what they call al-fatra, the period between two messengers. So a man who lived in that period will come on the Day of Judgment and say, oh Allah, please don't punish me, because as he says, as the hadith goes on to say, يقول يا رب ما أتاني لك من رسول. No messenger of yours came to me, messenger of Allah. Oh Allah, I was in that what? That fitra. So there's going to be some people who the message doesn't come to, but there's no community to whom a messenger was not sent. You guys see that? طيب. So we've done 2 verses. We come now to the 3rd verse, which is Surah Al-Isra, verse number 23, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. He says, and your Lord has decreed that you worship none except Him, and that you are dutiful to your parents. So now again, we have to look and see, okay, where does the ayah tell us that we have to worship Allah? We have to observe at-Tawhid. So now the word which he starts the verse with, which is qada, it has the meanings of wassa, wa alzam, wa awjab, to prescribe, to require, to mandate. So if somebody mandates something on you, is that optional? So when Allah says wa qada rabbuk, your Lord mandated, He required, it means it's what? Obligatory. What did He obligate? That we worship none except Him, which is at-Tawhid, And what this also goes on to say, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ, that you don't worship anyone except Him, which means the reality of worship in Islam is not just worshiping Allah, but worshiping Allah and not worshiping along with Him anything or anyone else. And so this is, in addition to a verse that tells us that Tawheed is wajib, It's a verse that also tells us that at-Tawhid, that worship is the exclusive right of Allah, which means if we establish something as worship and that thing is offered to someone other than Allah, what has just occurred? A shirk. You guys see that? Anytime something which is considered worship is offered to other than Allah, it's considered shirk, because Allah says, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ. Your Lord has decreed that you worship none besides Him. So that's 3 verses. Comes down to the 4th verse that he mentioned, which is from Surah An-Nisa, the 36th ayah, the 4th chapter, verse number 36. And in that verse, Allah, He mentions Ashratu Huquq. They call this verse Ayat al-Huquq al-Ashara. This is the verse where Allah mentions 10 rights. 10 rights which are owed to people, or 10 people, or 10 individuals, or 10 rights that are owed. So let's just put that. Let's not say people or individuals, but 10 rights that are owed. And the first one Allah mentioned is what? What's the first one He mentioned?
Worship.
Right. He says, وَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Worship Allah alone and do not worship along with Him any other deities. So He mentions 10 rights, and He starts out with His right, which means His right is what? Is the most important. You guys see that? And what is His right? That we worship Him and we don't associate partners with Him in our worship. So Allah is saying that is the highest priority. Highest priority for us, what? For the Muslim. The highest priority for the Muslim should be to worship Allah alone and to fulfill Allah's right to be worshipped alone. Also, if you notice again, He couples worshiping Him with not worshiping anything else. As if to say, if you worship along with me something else, you haven't really worshipped me. What I expect, what I demand, is that you worship me and nothing along with me. And that also, if you notice the wording of the verse in Arabic, it says, وَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا نَكِرَةٌ فِي سِيَاقِ النَّهِي. This is a singular noun in the context of forbidding. In Arabic, that indicates what we call an umum, generality and all-inclusiveness. So when Allah says that don't worship anything with me, it means there's no such thing as a negligible amount of a shirk. There's no such thing as a negligible amount of shirk. There's no such thing as say, well, it's just minor shirk. It's just minor. No, Allah says, don't associate anything with me. Nothing. No matter how trivial you think it is, don't do that, Allah is saying. But then after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Musannif, the author, he brings the ayah from Surah Al-An'am, the 6th chapter. Well, okay, show me, we didn't mention, from 436, what's the proof that at-Tawhid is wajib? Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What's the proof from that verse? 436.
Ordering, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering.
He ordered, right? If He ordered, it means it's obligatory. Good job. Jazakallah khair. Let's go now to chapter 6, Surah Al-An'am, verse 151, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says, قل تعالوا أتوا ما حرم ربكم عليكم ألا تشركوا به شيئا إلى آخر الآيات. So He said, come, I will rehearse to you what your Lord has prohibited. And the first thing He said was a shirk. The first thing that He mentioned is from the prohibitions is a shirk, which teaches us that the greatest prohibition, just like the greatest obligation is a tawheed, the greatest prohibition is a shirk. So now, how does that prove that a tawheed is wajib? Anyone? How does that prove? Because He didn't mention tawheed in that ayah. He mentioned a shirk. So how does that ayah prove that a tawheed is wajib? Okay, so the ayah says, قُلْ تَعَالُوا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. Say, O Muhammad, come, I will rehearse to you what your Lord has prohibited from you. Join not anything in worship with Him. So He's going to mention a lot of prohibited things. A number of them. The first one He mentions is a shirk. But nowhere in this ayah does it talk about what? Wujub at-Tawhid, using that wording. So how does the verse show us that a Tawhid is obligatory?
To avoid shirk, you must be on Tawhid.
Ahsant. That if Allah orders us to avoid a shirk, by necessity, by default, he's ordering us to do the what? The opposite. You guys see that? For example, let's say you came and I said, don't sit down. Do not, whatever you do, don't sit down. What am I ordering you to do then? Stand up. You guys see that? So if Allah prohibits us from committing a shirk, it's like he's ordering us to do what? A tawheed. You guys see that? Ahsantum. Good. But then we go now, he mentions the hadith of Mas'ud, in which he said that if you want to see the will and testament of the Prophet, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the will and testament of the Prophet, upon which is his what? His seal. So here, and he mentioned the ayah that the author just mentioned, which is the ayah from Surah Al-An'am. So basically when he says a will and testament upon which is his seal, it means I'm talking about something which is binding, which it has not been abrogated because it's what? It's sealed, right? And it's extremely essential and critical, or critically important to adhere to, because what? The Prophet what? It was his will, his final testament. Like, hey, I'm telling you, he's saying that is the final testament of the Prophet. قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا. He said, that is the wasi of the Prophet. Come, I will rehearse to you what your Lord has prohibited for you. Do not associate partners with Allah in worship. So what this teaches us is that not only are we required to observe a tawheed, but we also have to be extremely attentive to it, because he called it the Prophet's last will and testament. It means, brothers and sisters, that we have to not just know a tawheed, we have to be attentive to it. We have to be actively concerned about it, concerned about achieving it. And we can't be the people who are negligent concerning it, or even worse, the people who yuharibuna, the people who actually actively oppose and contradict it. You have some people who they speak about a tawheed as if they hate it. They're disgusted by it. They loathe it. They loathe the people who are attentive to it. We can't be those people, because Ibn Mas'ud went so far as to say this is what? The last will and testament of the Prophet, a tawheed, and avoiding a shirk. طيب ثم بعد ذلك حديث معاذ, which is the last text from this that he mentioned. And that's the hadith where, and this is because you talked about this earlier, this is the hadith where Mu'adh, he said that the Prophet turned to him, he said, أَتَدْرِي مَا حَقُّ اللَّهِ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ وَحَقُّ الْعِبَادِ عَلَى اللَّهِ. He said, do you know what is the right of Allah upon His servants, and what is the right of the servants upon Allah? Tell me how that shows that a tawheed is wajib. How does that show a tawheed is wajib?
So, if the slavers have came in the day of judgment and they didn't worship anyone but Allah, that means Allah will assure them that they will not be.
Well, what did you say earlier? You said it earlier.
Haqullah
Okay, haqq. So focus on that.
Yeah.
Turn your sights to the word haqq.
So that means you are obligated to do this
Because it's a
right.
right. It's my right. You guys see that? It means you have to do it. Is that not so?
No.
So do you know haqqullah al-ibad? Do you know Allah's right upon His slaves? I mean, they have to do it. They have no option, because it's His right and entitlement. And He didn't say as-salat. He didn't say az-zakat. He said Allah yushriku bihi shay'a. That right that the slaves owe to Allah is that they don't worship anything besides Him. So that's the proof that, or the implication of this hadith. That's the implication of this hadith, or the way that it proves that tawheed is wajib, is because he called it what? He called it tawheed haqqullah, the right of Allah. You have to do it. You guys see that? Now there's something that he mentioned toward the end of the hadith, because he told Mu'adh, he said, the haqqul ibadah Allah alla yu'adhib man la yushriku bihi shay'a. That Allah is not going to punish the person who observes a tawheed and does not associate partners with God. So Mu'adh was excited about that, because there's so many things that we're required to do in Islam, and people always feel, if they're honest with themselves, that they're falling short. So I want to tell people that, hey, despite your shortcomings, if you don't commit a shirk, Allah's not going to punish you. I want to be able to tell people that. I want to lift their spirit. So he said, أَفَلَا أُبَشِّرُ بِهِ النَّاسِ. He said, shouldn't I go and tell people, Rasulullah? People need to know this. And the Prophet said, لَا تُبَشِّرْهُمْ فَيَتَّكِلُوا. He said, don't inform them lest they rely upon it. Lest they rely upon it. Which means that this was not something that the Prophet was telling everybody, but he told select people like Mu'adh, who was very knowledgeable and well-respected Muslims. I want to digress here for just briefly and say that this part of the hadith, it teaches us something very, very important. Yarhamukallah. And that is that some knowledge, even though it's truth, if it's in the wrong hands, it becomes dangerous. It becomes knowledge in the wrong hands is like a weapon in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to use it. Imagine someone with a very powerful weapon, AR-14, AK-47, got a bunch of rounds and does not know how to use it. He's likely to do what? Shoot himself, blow off his own foot, or what? Or kill others, destroy property. Is that not so? Knowledge can be like that. There's something called dangerous knowledge, even though it's truth, because the person who has it doesn't know how to what? Use it, doesn't know how to give it to versus who to withhold it from. And there are people in our time, for example, before I say that, there are a number of statements from the early Muslims where they would warn people about this and basically convey this message. Look, you can't tell everybody everything. So for example, Ali radiallahu anhu, in Al-Bukhari, he's quoted as saying, حَدِّثُ النَّاسِ بِمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أي بِمَا يُمْكِنْ أَنْ يَعْرِفُوا أَتُرِيدُونَهُمْ أَنْ يُكَذِّبُ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. He said, when you speak to people, talk to them about the things that they can understand. Speak on their level and don't speak above their level. Do you want them to deny, to belie, to disbelieve in Allah and His Messenger? Which is what can happen if you start telling people everything, things they really can't fully fathom and understand. Similarly, Ibn Mas'ud, he was quoted Muslim as saying, ما أنت محدث قوما حديثا لا تبلغه أقولهم إلا كان لبعضهم فتنة. You're not going to sit in a gathering of people and talk to them about something that is beyond their scope, beyond their mental capacity. Except that some of them are going to be what? They're going to be put to trial by that. It's going to be a trial or a tribulation for them. And we have people, brothers and sisters, who there are what they call mustashrikun. There are these Orientalists who they go and they dig up old manuscripts. And they'll dig up a manuscript which has not been brought into what? A book form, something that people can just go to any bookstore or download a PDF and read this book. It's not available. It's like a manuscript where you have to go and check it out. And they'll go and they'll find these things and then they'll translate them and they'll do commentary on them. And the only actual copy of the book that people have access to is the one that was done by these mustashrikeen. And what are the Orientalists? They are people who are non-Muslims who study Islam to discredit it. So you have Muslims who will go and read these works and they'll become confused. They themselves become confused. But they won't stop there. They'll go and they'll do a YouTube video where they preach to the masses. Now, when you do a video on YouTube, can you control who's going to see it? Are there some people who can really understand what you're saying and maybe even refute what you're saying? And also people who have no clue what you're saying and they're probably going to be gullible and fall for everything you say? So you have people who go to YouTube and they'll take from these works of the Orientalists in the name of Islam and start teaching from ideas and thoughts and philosophies and perspectives that they've gotten from these books. And people will be confused to the point that I've seen the comments of people who said, yeah, I used to follow so-and-so, and now I'm no longer a Muslim. I used to watch the videos of so-and-so, and I became so confused, I almost left Islam. Thank God I stopped listening to so-and-so, because if I continued to listen to him, I would not be a Muslim anymore. People are saying these things about certain people who have millions of followers, who have PhD after their name, but they're misguiding people because why? They don't understand that you don't just tell everybody everything, especially the common Muslim who needs to know more about the oneness of Allah and how to worship Allah and how to develop taqwa than about whether or not the Quran was compiled correctly and what are the differences of opinion about whether it was compiled correctly. You follow what I'm trying to say? They're talking about these subjects that not everybody should hear about. So I just wanted to point out that we have to be careful. And we have to realize that some people are wolves in sheep's clothing. And they appear knowledgeable, and they appear pious, and they appear so scholarly. And in reality, they're undermining the Muslims, whether they're doing it wittingly or unwittingly, because they don't understand, as the Prophet said, that there's some knowledge which is dangerous and shouldn't be what? Shouldn't be given to everyone. But there's a few masail. The Shaykh, what he does at the end of each chapter, he'll say, fihi masail, meaning there's some important benefits that you can extrapolate from the ayat and a hadith or nusus that I quoted. And there's a few of them that I wanted to touch on just to make sure that we're clear on what he intended. So if you look on page 20 in the work, item number 2 says, worship is Tawhid. As in this issue, there has always been dispute between the prophets and polytheists, and we talked about that extensively, that in our religion, it's not enough to worship Allah. And worshiping Allah while associating partners with Him is not considered worship at all. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about ibadah in the Quran, primarily He's talking about Tawheed al-ibadah. Singling Him out in worship, because that is where the khusuma, that is where the debate and the conflict between the prophets and their peoples occurred. They didn't argue with their prophets about halal and haram for the most part. They didn't argue with their prophets about al-asma wa sifat, how Allah is supposed to be described and what His names are. They didn't argue with their prophets about Allah being the creator. وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ لَيَقُولُونَ اللَّهُ. If you ask them who created Allah, created the heavens and the earth, they will say Allah. They didn't have any dispute about that. But they would dispute about what? Allah being one. أَجَعَلَ الْآلِهَةَ إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا إِنَّ هَذَا لَشَيْءٌ عُجَابٌ. Has He made all of the deities one deity? That's strange to us, because we know what? We know worshiping many deities, not just one. You guys see that? So that's where the ma'araka was. And so that when we talk about worship, we're talking about what? Worshiping Allah alone. But number 3, he says, those who have not fulfilled the requirements of Tawheed are such as they have not worshipped Allah. And in this sense is the meaning of the verse, وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. This is kind of ta'keedan. This is something which is kind of like re-emphasizing what he already said. But I'll just mention another angle of it. And that is that if you look in the Quran, there's many times where Allah negates that the mushrikeen worship Him, or that they do worship. But they did. They used to give charity. They used to pray. They used to make dua. They used to make hajj, right? They used to make hajj, and they would do other acts of worship. But Allah negates all of it, because as soon as they associated others with Him, it negated that worship as if they hadn't done it at all, right? He mentions item number 4. He says the wisdom in sending the messengers. That the reason why the messengers were sent was to call to at-Tawhid. So if all the messengers were sent for this purpose, that means that if that was their priority, it should also be our priority as well. He says number 5, the message of the Prophet ﷺ applies to all nations. We talked about that. All communities receive the message, but not every individual. Number 6, he says all prophets have brought one and the same religion. There's only one religion with Allah. And all the prophets came with that religion. And what we should do is concern ourselves with following that religion. Is the religion, because nowadays we have Muslims who are trying to personalize Islam and trying to create versions of Islam. So there's a feminist Islam. There is an LGBTQ Islam. There is a modernist Islam. You even have people on the member talking about we need to have an American Islam. Is that the Islam of the prophets? The Islam that we want is Islam that's going to make us successful in this world and hereafter. And that message is what? It's one message. And that's very important, because you'll find repeated in the Quran, even in the Hadith, that the truth is one. The truth is one. And we can try to personalize the truth or paint the truth in a light that is acceptable to us. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be the judges. Allah's going to be the judge. And we want to come to Allah and meet Allah with an Islam that He will accept, not the Islam that is acceptable to us or to our tastes. And thumma ba'da dhalik, he says, number 7, the major issue is that the worship of Allah cannot be performed until at-Tawhid is denounced and rejected. And we kind of touched on that, so I won't labor that. Number 8, at-Tawhid is inclusive of all that is worship other than Allah. And that's what we talked about earlier. That anything worshipped besides Allah is a Tawhid. This is important and significant. Because typically what people will think when we say anything worshipped besides Allah, they'll think about worship as what? As prostrating to something other than Allah. Or fasting, giving zakat, charity, slaughtering for other than Allah. But we've seen from the hadith of Adi in the introduction that if you obey someone or something in contradiction to Allah's decree, then you've what? You've worshipped them just by obeying them. Remember that? He said, "Listen, Abudu ya Rasulullah." I said, we don't worship our monks and rabbis. That's not fair. That's going too far. So the Prophet said, أَلَا يُحَرِّمُونَ مَا أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ فَتُحَرِّمُونَ وَيُحِلُّونَ مَا أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ وَيُحِلُّونَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ فَتُحِلُّونَ. He said, didn't they make illegal what Allah made legal, so you made it legal? And didn't they make prohibited what Allah, didn't they make legal what Allah prohibited and you made it legal? And he said, Bala. He said, yeah, we did that. He said, Tilka ibadatuhum. He said, whether you realize it or not, you were worshipping them by what? Obeying them absolutely. So one Tawhid is these rulers and these authority figures in religion, etc., that get worshipped besides Allah. That's one type of Tawhid. But another Tawhid that many of us don't pay attention to is the Tawhid of science. The Tawhid of Western intellectualism, Western political system. That's also a Tawhid. In many cases, I'll give you the example of science. Now, that doesn't mean that Islam is at odds with science. Nobody should understand that. Because true science is what? It's the creation of Allah. It's the sunnah of Allah. But what Islam is at odds with, or what Islam says about science, is that science cannot trump Allah. Science cannot trump what Allah has said. And so what we find from some Muslims doing this is that, for example, you'll say something the Prophet said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Or you'll say something that Islam says. For example, that black seed is a cure for every disease except death. And the person will respond by saying, where's the science on that? Where's the science on that? As if to say, if science doesn't approve, it's wrong. That makes science a Tawhid. Why? Because you're making Allah's words and the words of His Messenger secondary in terms of acceptance. You guys see that? And so we have to be very careful, because when the prophets came and said, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. They weren't just talking about not bowing to an idol, not slaughtering for an idol. They're also talking about this, where something can take precedence and supersede what Allah and His Messenger have said. You guys see that? Like, ثم بعد ذلك, number 16. We did 8, right? Okay, number 16 was the last one I want to do. Permissibility, the permissibility to hide some knowledge for the common good as determined by the Sharia. And we talked about that somewhat extensively, that there's some knowledge that we should conceal. But what that does not mean is that we should lie. Because we find that some people won't like something or they'll have a hard time accepting something, then we'll lie. We're not authorizing lying in the name of trying to what? Protect the religion. And I'll give you an example of that. So we know that the Prophet ﷺ, he married Aisha radiallahu anha very young. And they were together and intimate when she was very young. And if we project back, basically means we look at that through our modern lens, and in the modern context, they call that pedophilia, right? But at that time, that was completely acceptable and normalized to the point that there were no criticisms for what the Prophet did, not from the Muslims, not from the pagans, not from the Jews, not from the Christians, because it was so what? It was so common. Even though he had so many enemies from all of these different areas and angles, none of them, they criticized him for everything, but they didn't criticize him for this because why? It was normalized. It was just perfectly normal. But now it's not normal, is it? And so people now, they want to rewrite history and say, oh, well, the Prophet, when he married her, she was 16, she was 18, she was 21. Because they feel like, look, if you tell people this, it'll run them away from Islam. Whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. You guys see that? And they think that it's applicable to what? Some knowledge you just hold from people. You withhold from. No, we don't lie. We're not ashamed of anything that's truly Islamic. But we do understand that some things that you don't share. But what if somebody came to you and asked you, hey, what's up with this young marriage of Aisha radiallahu anha? We're not going to lie and say, oh, no, it's a lie. She was 16. Bukhari, some of those are hadith and not authentic. And we're not going to say that. We're not going to lie and say that. You guys see that? And so we're not authorizing lying by any means, but rather what we're saying is that we recognize that there's some knowledge that shouldn't be shared with everyone. It was my intention to get through 2 chapters, but it's now 7:23, time for the adhan. And so we did get one, and hopefully we'll move a little bit faster next time. Are there any questions, comments, or critiques? تفضل شيخ.
So the last hadith, what is Abd'Llah, and Abd'Llah لا يشرك به شيئا. So it is not. Is it just introduce the importance of Tawhid, or does it also say that we have to worship Allah and have Tawhid, and then we will be guaranteed not to be, punished?
Yeah, if you look at the way that the hadith goes, it says, حق الله العباد أن يعبدوه ولا يشركوا به شيئا. That the right of Allah upon His servants is not just one right; it's 2 rights in one. That they worship Him, and that they don't associate in His worship anything besides Him. وحق العباد على الله, and the right of the servants upon Allah is that if they do that, then He won't punish them. So like you said, it takes 2 boxes you have to check in order to qualify for this virtue. And we're going to see that even more so in the next chapter, where he talks about the virtue of at-Tawhid. There's a hadith where he kind of hammers that point that you just made home, because it talks about that.
Yeah, because some people be like, if we just worship Allah by Himself and you didn't associate Him, that's basically what Islam is, and that's all we need to do. And yeah, I just want to.
Yeah, he actually talks about that, or touches on that. But even the hadith itself, toward the end, where the Prophet said, "La tubashiruhum fayattakilu," he said, don't give them the glad tidings, because they'll just rely on that. They won't work. There's actually another version of that hadith, or something, a similar hadith, which was reported by Abu Hurairah. And that's the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was reported to have said, and Abu Hurairah was narrating it, where the Prophet said, من شهد أن لا إله إلا الله مستيقنا به فله الجنة أو دخل الجنة أو كما قال. So Abu Hurairah, basically the hadith says, whoever testifies that there's no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and he does so with certainty, he'll enter paradise. So Abu Hurairah, he narrated this hadith in front of Umar ibn Khattab. And Umar, he hit him on his chest and knocked him to the ground. And he said, Irja. He said, go back. Meaning, go back to the Prophet, because I don't think you heard that right. So Abu Hurairah, he went back and he told the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ what happened. So the Prophet ﷺ, he summoned Umar. And he said, why did you do that? And he said, خشية أن يتكلوا ويدعوا العمل. I feared they would just rely on that and not do anything. They wouldn't work. فخليهم يعملون. He said, so Messenger of Allah, let them what? Let them work. And then you know what the Prophet said? He said, فخليهم. He said, yeah, Let them work. Al-Muhim, that the point I'm trying to make is that the Prophet himself was aware. Umar was aware. Other people were aware that, yeah, this is not something you tell just everyone, because some people do just like what you say. If we have a Tawhid, we're good. So why do anything else? That's not what the Prophet meant. The Prophet was trying to shine the light, highlight the virtue of a Tawhid and its importance and its essential nature. He was not trying to tell people, just what? Kick back, you're good to go, you're saved because you're a muwahid.
Because you're still going to be punished for it.
And we're going to see that as well. Yeah, we're going to see that as well. In the next chapter, and that's a beautiful thing about the way that he sets up the book. Every chapter builds off of what? The other one. He can't say everything in one chapter. But he started out by just talking about what wujub, at-Tawhid. You have to do this. We have to be here for this. We have to study this. We have to give importance to this. This is what he's trying to. You don't have it's not optional. It's not. It's Monday, but I don't feel like it. If we're not getting it here, we should be getting it somewhere, because this Tawhid is of central importance in our religion. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And everything else in our religion means nothing without what? Without this. This is basically what the Imam was doing in this chapter. And then he'll build off of that. Like, any other questions, comments?
You talk about science, and like people argue with science a lot of times, but I feel like a reasonable rebuttal, whatever, to that would be the fact that a lot of the science in the Quran itself was far beyond science, like hundreds of years beyond science. And so in stating some of these things, like this could heal anything, you don't really need to prove anything, because, I mean, the science was so far beyond its time. Like, is it really worth even trying to argue against that,
And this is why we said at the outset that we're not saying, or I'm trying to imply that Islam is at odds with science like other faiths. One of the criticisms of other faiths is that they were always at odds with science, and they would put things in their books that contradicted science and then were scientifically proven to be wrong, and that forced the followers of those faiths to belie those faiths. We don't have that issue in Islam. That even the things that have not been proven by science have not also been disproven by science. Like you said, the science is just way ahead, or the science in the Quran is way ahead. But many of the things have been proven by science. Not just proven generally, but with intense precision. The accuracy and precision of the Quran is beyond what anybody could have imagined, especially that long ago, without the technological advancements and equipment, etc., and so on. So there's no question that Islam is not at odds with science, but what Islam is at odds with is science becoming now a judge, right, over Islam. And if science didn't say it, it's wrong. Even if it came from Allah. No. If it came from Allah, it's right, period. Regardless of what science says. That's what we're saying. Yeah. Like any other. Going once, going twice, gone. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Which one? This? Really? You don't need that kind of gadgets, man. Now I need this. Yeah, it's time. It's actually time.